Good afternoon. I am indeed Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, and I'm happy to welcome you. I am a brown-skinned African-American man with lucite glass frames, a blue blazer, a red, white, and blue checked shirt. I'm here in my library with books around me, and my pronouns are he, him. I am really thrilled to have as my guest today for Ideas at Ford, my friend, Dr. Dambisa Moyo. I have known Dambisa for many years since she burst on the stage with one of her many extraordinary books that brought critical acclaim and a discerning perspective from the perspective, again, of this woman economist, Zambian, Oxford-trained PhD. She is an extraordinary leader, economist, and friend. I want to introduce her and have her join me to talk about her book, How Boards Work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dambisa Moyo.
Thank you so much, Darren. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Dambisa Moyo. I'm a global economist and author, Black, born and raised in Africa, spending most of my life in the United States now. But on this occasion, I am dialing in from London. I am as Darren mentioned, an economist, and I go by pronouns she, her. And I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk about all things boards, but also more importantly, the role of corporations in the 21st century.
Well, Dambisa, you and I have talked about this issue on many occasions, and you and I have some experience on public company boards, because that's what we're really talking about here. We're talking about, there are all kinds of boards, but we are primarily, what you talk about is based on your experience, which is primarily of serving on large Fortune 500 multinational company boards. So tell us just some of the boards you have served on.
Yes, so I currently serve on the board of 3M. We're making the masks, in fact, one of the largest market shares in the N95, N99 masks. So we've kind of moved from stickies, as many people know us for our sticky pads, to now masks. I'm also on the board of Chevron, which is powering energy around the world. Obviously, still trying desperately to get and help 1.5 billion people around the world who don't have access to energy on a reliable, sustainable, cost-effective basis to be able to really materially change their lives by tapping into that. I'm also on the board of Condé Nast media company, which was established in the early 1900s. It's family-owned, privately held, a phenomenally important company in the media space, and being a tastemaker with titles from Vogue to Architectural Digest. And I have also, over the past 10 years, served on boards, mining companies, banks, as well as technology companies and consumer goods. And I'm really thrilled to tap into that experience, noting that I do believe that a lot of that experience does transcend just private sector corporations into NGOs, as well as trustees and foundations as well.
Most definitely. So let's get down to the book, because the book is in many ways a meditation on your experience over this decade plus of service. And you put into very, I think, very compelling storytelling what you have experienced, but you then organize it around these categories of knowledge and interest. So I want to talk first about this idea that corporations have a lot of power. So let's be really, let's not waste any time here. These are powerful institutions. And when you are in the boardroom with management, with the other directors, you are stewarding billions, if not trillions of dollars of capital. So let's talk about this question of power. Are there limits to that power? I mean, people think corporate boards have tons of power, and why don't you just go in the boardroom and do this?
What a wonderful way to start the conversation. Just to put it in context, I wrote the book for two reasons. One is to really reassert the important role that corporations play and must play in order to contribute to human progress. everything from creating jobs, providing a tax base, being at the tip of the spear in terms of innovation, as we've just seen with vaccine rollout in partnership with government. But secondarily, I wanted to really explain the three-part responsibility of corporate boards in shepherding and chaperoning these large, global, complex organizations. And I know we're going to get more into this, particularly as the responsibilities have expanded to include ESG and how that plays out, particularly at a time where there are greater demands on everything from climate change to racial and gender equity, issues of worker advocacy, concerns around pay equity, data privacy, obesity, voter rights, etc. And how it is corporations can be expected to participate in these important challenges, given that they are not elected representatives. The question of power at its core is a very interesting point, because with power ought to come responsibility. But for every one of the issues I just laid out, as you know, Darren, these issues are often very complex and do have trade-offs. And I do believe that the best organizations, the best leaders, whether they're in government, in the private sector, or indeed in the civil society, are aware and very attuned to these trade-offs and how they complicate issues, leading us into a situation where power must actually translate into much more, I would argue, less hasty, more innovative, more considered responses to this whole array of challenges that the world faces today.
Well, we certainly see during this time of the pandemic, and we'll get into the racial reckoning and the gender equity issues, but during this COVID period, it's very clear that inequality has really been revealed in ways that many did not understand before. And the role of corporations in this regard, I think, is central. We're all capitalists here, but we have to realize that capitalism isn't working for a lot of people. And so the role of the corporation is critical, because to the extent that the corporation can generate more shared prosperity, can generate examples of boards taking steps that actually are responsive to these challenges of COVID or inequality or racial reckoning. How do you think about that as a director?
Well, to me, it's an existential crisis. In the book, I talk about the first boards really being established in the 1600s. And so they've been around for a long time. And really, I argue in the book that there are three responsibilities of the board. Traditionally, we focus on the first two, the first one being overseeing strategy. What does the company produce? Where does it produce it? How does the company compete? The second one is really about hiring, and in some instances, unfortunately, firing the CEO. I mean, this is an important role, not just because the CEO is obviously wants to be the leader in driving performance and long-term success, but also as a standard bearer of the cultural values of a company. And then the third part is this question around what I would call corporate responsibility or ESG. So really about oversight on this very important and constantly moving and evolving narrative on this list that we just went through. I absolutely believe that these are not sort of issues that are up for debate in a sort of fundamental way about whether or not, in a normative way, whether or not we should do these things. This is an existential crisis. If you are not involved in being much more equitable in terms of part of your employee population or your board or your C-suite, if you're not involved in addressing worker concerns or not involved in climate change, you will not survive in the 21st century. So the question is not, to my mind, whether or not we ought to be moving in the direction that society is telling us, i.e. that it's no longer enough to say that the business of business is business, but really to understand that we're part of communities and part of society, and that requires more responsibility and more effort. But the question before us, to my mind, is that we do need to take into consideration that we're not chasing or embarking on a sort of pursuing these agendas without due consideration for people who could be left behind. Of course, and I know we're going to get into this, but questions of making sure we don't fight racial discrimination by discriminating other groups, or, for example, pursuing climate change without due regard for the 1.5 billion people around the world who have no access to energy and whose lives are materially altered by the lack of, or by living in a world of energy poverty. We need to bring everybody on board. Otherwise, these interventions will not be sustainable, to my mind.
So how do we think about this? Because the reality, Dambisa, is that we can talk about these things in the abstract, but there are corporate behaviors that do harm. And
Absolutely.
the question is real. And for directors, when we are in the boardroom and the conversation around environmental impact on production or on the environment, these are real conversations. These are real fundamental
Absolutely.
issues. And I start because some to raise your hand and say, hey, wait a minute. I just saw this piece of data on plastics. How are we addressing that in our packaging, et cetera? Do you find that from where you sit, because you are often the only one, and I wanna jump into that when you answer this, because I want to get into Dambisa, the only one. There's some good stuff in your book about being the only one. But first, this issue, how do you speak up? How do you raise your hand? Because the reality is most of the people in the room are white men who have similar background and experiences and see things in a normative way. How do you be fully Dambisa?
So look, I take a sort of two approaches to this. So first of all, I actually wear my differences with pride, because I know I'm going to be remembered. The number of times, even when I worked at Goldman Sachs, for example, that I was the only woman and or only visible minority in terms of my race, were countless. But rather than sort of bemoan that, I actually realized, wait a second, they may not remember my name because it's not sort of a common name, certainly not in the West, but they'll certainly remember, hey, there was that person who stood out. And so I really focus more on making sure that, I try to err on the side, as challenging as it may be, of sort of it being an opportunity to really leave a mark just because I was there. The other point, which I think really as a practical matter, is that I think too often we can lose an argument if people view it as being, if I may, dare I say it, emotional or not grounded in thoughtful analysis. And so, you just pointed out, as in your example, you could point out a paper and say, hey, this is what's happening on plastics. What are we doing on that? I think from my vantage point, and to quote my friend and yours, Melody Hobson, the numbers don't lie. And more to my mind, we have cases in all of these things, whether it's climate change, racial discrimination, that back a narrative that change must happen. And it's not happening. And I think it's very hard to sway people of the majority if we say, I really want you to change your approach simply because I feel uncomfortable. I think it's a much more compelling argument to say, well, actually, this is not going to work. If you are in a custodial fiduciary role to see this company succeed over the long term, here are reasons and here's data to show that if you want to succeed, you need to be more diverse at the board level, at the C-suite level, and in the workforce writ large. And so, I will put my hand up and say I come from a data-driven background. And so, as an economist, as a chemist, I tend to reach for data. But I think that from my vantage point is a better way, it has been a much more effective way of swaying opinions than perhaps maybe what a sociologist might argue. I don't know whether there's one that's right or wrong. I'm just telling you what I feel has been effective in the rooms that I've served in.
Well, I think both perspectives are needed. That's why diversity matters. And I appreciate something you say in the book, which is those of us who are on boards, who are Black, who are queer, who are whatever we may be, we don't want to be there because of our identity. But what I regret and resent sometimes is that people will think, well, let's get a Black person for the board. Let's get a woman for the board. Well, that's their thinking, right? So the challenge here is that sometimes I'm frustrated in nom-gov conversations or with people when they say, well, we don't want someone just because they're a minority. I'm not asking you to put someone on the board because they're a minority. There
Absolutely.
are qualified people with the credentials we are looking for.
Absolutely.
We may need to look harder, but no one is asking you to put a Black or woman on the board because they're Black or woman.
Thank you.
Now, the way that has happened, though, in many of the spaces I have been in, are that white men will make that assessment, or they will say that, right? So the white directors will say, well, we're not looking for someone. No one ever asked you for that. How do you, I love the vignette of you at the shareholders meeting and walking up onto the stage, and we've all been there at the shareholder meeting and being the only one, and a shareholder standing up and literally saying to the chairman and CEO, what is she doing on the board? What qualifications does this woman have to be on our board? Now, obviously, he hadn't read the proxy statement to see your bio, or he wouldn't, but he obviously walked into the room and saw a Black woman on the stage with these white men and immediately said, oh, she's here just because she's Black and she's not qualified.
That's exactly right. And look, I take very, very deep issue with this. You and I and many other people who look like us and people who don't look like us have worked tremendously hard to actually make our mark in the world and to contribute to a better world. The most demeaning thing, I would argue, is being asked to be in a particular position because of my race or my gender. And it's happened to me. And I will tell you, I have never minced words. On one occasion, a chairman said, oh, we're looking for a Black woman to be on a board. I said, let me stop you right there. I'm not your person. I said, I've spent too long in capital allocation and risk assessment, doing my PhD at Oxford, my master's at Harvard, to come here and be belittled, ostensibly belittled, as being really only value add to the extent of my race and gender, two things in my case that I didn't have any control over. And so I do think we should take issue with this. I will tell you also on the other side, I've had situations where I've been recruiting, interviewing candidates, and someone will say with a phenomenal resume, a woman in particular comes to mind who came to an interview, phenomenal resume, and it's all the skills we were looking for. And I said, well, what makes you interested in this company? And she said, oh, it was because I understood that you were looking for women board members. I was like, why would you say that? Like, you have so much more to offer than just that. And, wherever I have an opportunity, I emphasize to people, there is no need for us to be in a position where we have to lean in based on our race and gender. We are talented people. And as you say, we are not asking for favors. We're only asking for a fair shot. And there is an argument that actually your race and gender, et cetera, might get you an interview. It's not going to get you the job, because ultimately there's a job to be done. Whether you're on the risk committee or compensation, there's a job to be done. I'll conclude by just saying one last point, which is the good news is that I think people now look around and say, actually, gosh, I hadn't realized there's so much talent. And it did take widening the aperture in some respects. I'm not a conventional board member. I didn't come from the C-suite. And so, I hope I add value in the boardrooms in which I serve to talk about geopolitics. I've traveled to over 80 countries, et cetera. So hopefully there's value add there. But I really do not think we ought to stand for this narrative that somehow we're in these boardrooms because we're Black or a woman or from a certain background. I think we really need to, and fortunately, there's so much talent out there that I think it won't be long before it will become irrelevant, as it rightly should be.
Well, I do think, though, that there is, and there has been, a sense of tokenism around that. I have had conversations on the boards I serve where I've been the only one. And I will say that this is tokenism, because the way, unfortunately, this has been framed in the past is people think, oh, we've got a Black, we've got a gay person, check, we're done on diversity. We've got a Black, we've got a Latinx, we're done on diversity. And again, diversity, we're not doing you a favor. You are more likely to be a successful company, as you say in your
exactly right.
book. There is a higher ROI.
Correct.
If you are more diverse. So exactly. The point here is to say you should be more diverse, and the notion of a framework, a mindset that says, let's get one Black, one brown, and we'll be diverse, and the other 12 directors are white. How do we really get at that is the other thing. We need to move, as Vernon Jordan said to me once, for his generation to get in the boardroom, just to be in the boardroom was a phenomenal breakthrough, right? So he's on the board of IBM. Tom Watson wasn't about to put another Black on the board of IBM, but his admonition to me was always, your generation has to do better. And it's one of the things that has stuck with me when I'm in NomGov, when I'm talking about succession planning. I don't want to be the only one. And so I've actually said very clearly on the board that I serve that I really don't want to be the only one. And you get into this dynamic where, oh, Darren, you're not a token. How can you say that? You're so, okay. But from the mindset, I just want you guys to, and I think the hard part is engaging in those conversations around a board table with mostly white people, mostly white men, who until recently have been these issues have just been very remote. I don't know about how you deal with that.
Yeah, no, I think there's another aspect to this also, which is undergoing change. And I alluded to it a moment ago, which is to say that traditionally, the way the route to the boardroom was seen as very clearly through the C-suite. We wanted CEOs, CFOs, and maybe COOs. And whether that was de facto or de jure racism or misogyny, the fact of the matter is, to the extent that there weren't women and minorities in the pipeline, you ended up with exactly what you ended up with, which is mainly white, mainly male. I do think that there, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's a clear recognition that their talent to drive success of corporations over the long term requires different perspectives. I mean, God forbid you're on the board of a pharmaceutical company now and you don't have academic perspective, for example, on vaccine production or vaccine creation. I just think that these types of widening of the aperture, as I said earlier, to draw in new talent, given the issues that the world is facing today, whether it's deglobalizations, in issues of digitization, inequality. This requires not just a narrow, sort of perspective that may come from just being a CEO or CFO, but really broadening out academic, public policy, and alternative other backgrounds that can add true value for long-term success. Not just about survival. It's not just to survive, it's also to thrive and compete in the 21st century. This is motherhood and apple pie. You will not be able to compete in a world without more diverse voices and more diverse perspectives in your corporation. It's as simple as that.
Well, you have a chapter in the book on the BRT's move away from the Friedman ideology of the role of the social role of business is business. And this idea that Friedman propagated that really became the theology of most corporations, which is a very narrow idea that the corporate responsibility is profit. And I personally was happy that the BRT moved away from that. I think the reality of executing on that is much harder. Much harder. But it is an existential crisis that has to be addressed. So talk a little bit about this notion of, yes, we understand the fiduciary responsibility, we understand loyalty, all of those business terms, legal terms, but in practical terms, how does this work? And how does this lead us to a conversation about what happened at your competitor ExxonMobil recently with a group of relatively obscure owners of ExxonMobil shares ending up with 3 board seats?
So let me start by putting my hand up and saying, I do think at the margin, Milton Friedman's been treated quite shabbily with respect to this. I understand absolutely. I've read his.
Oh, you're
his
an economist. Of course you do, Dambisa. I think you've been treated too nicely, but go ahead.
I read his 1970 article in the New York Times, which you're alluding to. And you're right, he was very clearly made that statement. However, if you read the whole document, and there are other weaknesses, he makes no reference to the board role, etc. But right. One of the things that he does say, which does give us enough degrees of freedom, is to say his view is obviously subject to ethical and moral changes in society. And of course, we've landed in exactly right. that world. And so I do feel slightly sorry for him. I never met him, but I do feel like there is that nuance that's important.
And he also said, Dambisa, just on this point, in fairness to him as someone who you would probably say has treated him shabbily, he also said that the role of the company was not to worry about things that we would now call gender equity and racial justice. He said the role of the company is not to worry about those things. That's government's responsibility to be focused on those things. The role of the company is to be regulated, and that tension is what happens in a capitalist democracy society. So he was right, technically, in that the role of public policy. What he didn't anticipate maybe was that government then becomes captured by the corporate elites, and then of course we get what we have today. But anyway, I don't want to cut you off. Continue. He was treated shabbily. Go ahead.
No, and so, but notwithstanding that point, we get to 2019, and as you rightly point out, Business Roundtable says, wait a second, we have massive inequality, social breakdown of social mobility. We've got issues around climate change. We've got real inequity emerging around the world, and not just in health and education, but also in wealth and income, opportunity, etc. And that there was not going to be a free pass for corporations. But you've touched on a really important point. I believe that to the extent that there has been a history of success in the United States, for example, which we know there has, it has been government working with civil society and the private sector. Whether it's the Manhattan Project, DARPA, development of Silicon Valley, the rollout of the interstate network. I mean, go read Felix Rohatyn's book, or even more recently, Margaret Amara's book called The Code, about the development of Silicon Valley. We cannot, I do not believe, expect corporations to really solve all of these problems for the very reason I mentioned a moment ago, which is that we're not elected officials. I do worry, I must tell you, Darren, that there could very soon be a backlash where people say, wait a second, what are you doing telling us that this is a sort of appropriate education for our children? We actually did not ask you to do that. So government has an important role to play. I love something that Mike Bloomberg, our former mayor of New York, is allegedly has said, which is that government, the most efficient governments are those that are data-driven. They are really focused on forward-leaning, so future-looking, measured outcomes, and they're not corrupt. If you have a government that is that, then you're really off to the races. And I do worry every now and then that corporations are being asked to plug in gaps where government is not doing what it ought to do to the nth degree. Government has got a lot of issues. Corporations do have to step up, absolutely. But, to quote something that President Obama said, which I put in my book, these are very complex issues. And he talks about by the time something hit his inbox, it meant it was very difficult. If it were easy, someone else would have solved it. And we're in exactly that situation, which is that principally, as we can ascribe and celebrate the Business Roundtable, taking that really important step to proclaim the importance of broadening the utility function of corporations. But as a practical matter, it's not just getting trapped in the quagmire of metrics that's the problem. It's going beyond that. It's about trade-offs. What should we do about the billion plus people who got no energy if we just turn the lights off because of climate change? This is not at all, just to be clear, to dispute that climate change, for example, is not hugely important and hugely urgent. But we can't run society in a zero-sum way. And I think that that's where the challenges really emerge. Look, I will just conclude. I'm not in the ExxonMobil boardroom, so I can't say more than what I saw in the press like everyone else. But what I will say is that I found in my experience interacting with a lot of activists and other outside shareholders that very often they get into the boardroom and they realize it's not as easy as it might seem to implement some of these complex things. As I said earlier, to use President Obama's statement, if it were easy to solve, it would have been solved. And so, I think that's an important point. And I'm very sensitive to this as somebody who was born and raised in Africa, where I worry that issues around energy really will consign billions of people to more poverty, over their lifetimes.
No, and I think it's again, one of the things you bring is that perspective. So again, that's the diversity that you the layers of diversity that you bring. But there is the reality, though, that corporations are social actors. I mean, in fact, in the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled repeatedly that corporations under the Constitution are people. I mean, that in fact, and like any wealthy, powerful person, there are responsibilities and accountabilities that come with that. And I think the challenge for boards is working with management to manage the many stakeholders, our shareholders, our employees. And I want to talk to you about the employees, because something that I have seen in the last few years that didn't exist a few years ago was the ascent of the employee resource groups. I wonder if on your boards, but I certainly would say, and on my boards, the employees, and in the last year, certainly the Black employee resource groups, their voices have been heard as they never were before. And I have seen this as a powerful force within the company to elevate this idea that employees want to work for companies who share their values. You have spoken about this, written about this notion that the race for talent, part of that is about that talent feeling that they want to work for a company that is aligned with their personal values. How do you see that from the board perspective?
Well, I'm from an older generation. And so, I mean, just to
Dambisa, you're not from an older generation.
I am. I'm over 50. That means older
Dambisa.
Generation. And so in that respect, it jars this whole notion of bringing your whole self to work. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's not where I was raised. But however, I am part of teams that are overseeing that generational shift. And I'm very attuned to it. And I'm very cognizant and sensitive to the fact that people do feel like how they feel about their world and their worldview and values should be reflected in the company. But I'll say what I said already a moment ago, which is to say, I have no problem with that as long as it doesn't alienate other people. Now, I'm not saying we want the Ku Klux Klan marching in the lobby of company X, but what I am saying, and I was struck by a question that was posed to me in one of a speaking engagement I had recently, a gentleman came on and he said, look, I'm a white conservative Christian. I do feel very ignored and neglected from the broader debate. How is will boards think about me? Will they take that into consideration? And you and I can have a debate about whether or not really that, some people will say that's absurd. He's been the majority, he's had a great life. What is he talking about? But others will say, well, we start delving into inequality. There is a working class. We know from the Hillbilly Elegy et cetera. So these things are quite layered. All I will say again is going back to this point of trade-offs. We want society to move forward. I have to tap into my economics literature, which is being Pareto efficient. We want as many people as possible, if not the whole of society, to progress forward without losing one person, making one person worse off. And that's a delicate balance. But nevertheless, an important one. And I do think we need more input from employees and how they're feeling. Ultimately, Darren, I do believe that companies have really, when it comes down to it, two important levers that we can use. One is around compensation, and I can assure you in the boardrooms in which I serve, compensation is now more and more reflecting climate, reflecting the need for equity across gender and race, et cetera. In some cases, up to 30% of someone's compensation is reflected by these ESG issues. The other issue is who we hire. The CEOs, in the book, I talk about how in just 18 months, over 400 CEOs and business leaders were fired for Me Too infractions. I think we as leaders in the boardroom have every ability to hire people who will be standard bearers on these issues of value. And I talk a lot about how ethics, to my mind, has been an area we just don't explore enough of. We talk about financial acumen and, has this person run teams? What's their leadership style? But where is the real delve into ethics? We tend to rely on somebody's references. And I think there's a lot of scope and opportunity to do more of that in addressing affinity groups and networks and the needs of broader communities.
Thanks, Dambisa. I think it's time for us to go to Q&A. Sierra, I bet we have some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you both. So we'll start. There's a few questions around advocating for boards to be selected on qualifications and experience rather than race and gender. So, a couple people are asking if you could explain why, in your minds, recent initiatives and programs have been launched specifically geared towards race and gender. How do we make the check the box approach to diversity and inclusion in these spaces less likely to happen?
Well, in terms of why they've happened, it's no doubt in my mind that it's whether there's sort of two very strong impetus that we've seen. One is in places like the UK, where I am today, you've had real active public policy initiatives. There's a report, Sir John Parker's report, which is targeting, recommends that boards have certain representation in terms of race. We've had the 30% club here, but also in the US, you've seen California move to explicitly require much more diversity in terms of its boards. And of course, I can go on and on. Scandinavia, France, et cetera, have been explicitly mandating that boards, publicly traded corporations in particular, have a certain proportion of gender, but also more and more racial diversity. So that's obviously one impetus. The other one, of course, which has really been driven by asset managers such as BlackRock, but obviously ultimately also by asset owners, you and I as pensioners, and as people who are interested in society progressing, we are interested in seeing society better reflect reflected in the boardroom. And that's whether, as regulators, as employee base, as investors, as customers, clients, society writ large. We want to see that reflected not just in the boardroom, but also in the C-suite and workforce more generally. So, to my mind, those are the two key drivers. But ultimately, as we talked about earlier, whether it's in return on invested capital, return on equity, to me, this is all good stuff. It's moving in the right direction, and it won't be long, as far as I'm concerned. I look around, and the competition's already tough. Darren will tell you that, I'm no longer competing with the white guy for a board seat. I'm competing with talented women who look like me, men and women who are of different backgrounds and races, and they have amazing capabilities and rightly should be taking these seats.
Thank you. And to that same point, what is your advice to women in the C-suite who aspire to serve on public boards? How do you specifically navigate the diplomacy and build the social networking capital that's necessary to get in that room?
Well, I think that, again, the world is changing materially. Over 10 years ago, when I joined my first board, by the way, just to be clear, and I think this is an important point, it took me 7 years to get on my first board. I tried desperately. I wasn't fully aware that boards were really seeking C-suite candidates, and nobody tells you that until you realize that you're not getting selected, even or shortlisted for interviews. So I think that the traditional route for people who are in the C-suite is to go through headhunters. At my time, when I first joined, I was on a number of boards, 3 or 4 boards, and I had not been in any of those boardrooms through a headhunter. They'd never sought me out. In fact, one of the lead directors on one of my boards said to me, "How come I don't know you? What does this mean?" And I said, "Oh, I think it's because I'm not from the C-suite." So we've changed that. And certainly in the boardrooms that I'm in, we say we want to see broad array of candidates. And I think that corporations are now leaning into that idea. But there's no doubt about it. Your network matters. It absolutely does. It matters because, CEOs are busy. I think a lot of board members, and perhaps myself included, can be seen as quite with a bit of a lazy muscle. You're looking for a candidate, you go for the people that you know, or the people that you've interacted with. I do think that there are some hidden opportunities. So obviously, as I said, search firms are sort of a necessary evil. You should engage with them because they now have a sort of revised mandate to look for great candidates, regardless of whether or not they've come from the C-suite. A second point is the network, but the third point, which I think is highly overlooked, are the organizations, the professional services, auditors, lawyers, subcontractors that provide advice to the C-suite as well as the board. I don't think we think a lot about them as being a route to providing advice and counsel on how to get on boards. But I mentioned already, lead with your talent, with your skills. There's a job to be done. We have to audit financials. We've got to think about allocating capital. We've got to pay compensation. All of these are very complex issues in the world that's constantly changing. We're often global corporations. And so, rather than leading with, I'm a woman and I'm in the, working here, I'm a Black person there, I would say, listen, I've done risk all my life, or I'm really good at compensation issues. And I happen to be a Black woman, and that's added value for you. But really, my talent is, bringing in real value adds to make sure that these companies continue to be going concerns over time.
Dambisa, the thing I would add on that point is also talk to your CEO, because certainly the boards I'm on, high potential talent who are in the line of potential succession candidates, one of the things we often want to see is that they've served on a board of another major company.
That's right.
Right. So that actually, most boards, or at least I should say the ones I'm on, at least, when we look at succession planning and we say, here are half a dozen executives at the company, one of the things we want is for them all to be on a corporate board. And that conversation ought to be happening with your CEO and the lead director.
Absolutely. Good point.
Thank you. And so how can the experience of participating in a corporate board be related or compared to being on a nonprofit board? What do the two need to learn from each other?
Well, so let me start with the sort of low-hanging fruit, which is what can corporate boards learn from not-for-profits. We just talked a big chunk of today, the time today, about ESG, environmental, social, and governance changes, this broadening of the utility function. This is motherhood and apple pie for not-for-profits. I recall something that Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, said at an event he and I spoke at a number of years ago. He said, what's easier, also what's harder to run, a for-profit or not-for-profit? And the answer was absolutely, it's certainly resounding sense in the room that it was a not-for-profit that's much harder. You've got more vested interests. I mean, for us, traditionally we just said, hey, it's all about returns of financial shareholders there, the primacy is theirs. And so we can absolutely learn, how do we navigate and prioritize these different directions, whether it's employees, unions, government, regulators, financial shareholders, etc. So that's a lot to learn there. On the other side, unlike other people, I actually think that there's a lot of synergies and sort of overlap between not-for-profits and for-profits. We both have to set strategy in a very complex world. We both have to figure out audit and our financial services. We think about compensation. We obviously have to think about hiring. And so I actually look very kindly on people who have actually got not-for-profit experience. And I think that that this is something, again, going back to the widening of the aperture, that maybe traditionally has been overlooked. But in a world where the Business Roundtable is now really center stage and ESG, and as we emerge from COVID, how are we thinking about climate change and all these other issues, particularly around inequality? It's going to be ever more important, I think, to bring those perspectives in, with the caveat that ultimately these organizations have to move forward. To my mind, and I know, Darren, you might have a slightly different view here, but because of the complexity, we're not trying to create fissures and be so ideological in the boardroom that we can't move the tanker forward. These are very nuanced issues. We want to move society forward, and we have a key responsibility to do that. But I think, again, thinking about trade-offs and being sensitive to these issues, the complexity of these issues is going to be really important.
Thank you. And I'll make this my last question from the audience. If for-profit corporations aspire to create social value, in addition to shareholder value as measured by return on investment, valuation, and stock price, how can we start to think about the metrics for the social value that's created?
Well, I would say the good news here is that there's a lot of work from my field, which is traditionally macroeconomics. I would not at all suggest that we have the answer. We have tended to focus in sort of based on 1930s, Simon Kuznets, the Russian-American economist who developed the GDP numbers, and really focusing, and they were actually beneficial. They helped us look at countries' performance over time, but also compare one country against another. We know the weaknesses of that. There's no doubt about it. But we now, over the last decade, we've invested heavily in wellness metrics. We're looking more at happiness indices. President Sarkozy, former President Sarkozy in France, but also Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand is specifically implementing these as ways to think about really broader societal gains rather than just GDP metrics. So I'm very optimistic about what this looks like. I think it's really, it's growth enhancing, if I use the word growth, not to mean money. I'm talking about longevity issues around climate change, about societal value, but also in human progress more generally. So complex stuff, but the mood music is moving in the right direction.
Well, Dambisa, this has been a great conversation, and I always enjoy when you and I talk because first you are so damn smart, but you also bring a lot of passion, and it is always a treat to be with you. And this is your, I lost count, what, 6, 7, 8 book? This is your 5th book.
Only number 5.
But maybe it's all of those articles I've also read. But it's really true. You are just an extraordinary scholar, but you're also a practitioner of what you preach and write and teach. And that is all a part of this wonderful book, which is certainly a gift to corporate America and to corporations and stakeholders in corporations and nonprofits. As you said, I think there is a lot. As someone who also serves on many nonprofit boards, there is much that is generalizable and transferable from the for-profit. So thank you, Dambisa, for this. I am really happy that you were with me today on Ideas at Ford, and I am happy to share that we have a very exciting series coming up. On June 21, we have Annette Gordon-Reed, the Pulitzer Prize winning author and Harvard Law professor, on Juneteenth, which will be a very, I think, powerful conversation. Annette and I are both Native Texans, where Juneteenth was first celebrated. And so we'll talk about that. On July 7th, someone you know, Dambisa, Ursula Burns, who will
That
be here
greatly
to talk,
admire.
and she is a Ford Foundation trustee and will be here to talk about her memoir, Where You Are Is Not Who You Are. And it's a really terrific book, got a great review in both the Wall Street Journal over the weekend and the New York Times last week. And then in September, we have Rob Reich and Jeremy Weinstein, the Stanford University professors on technology and system error. So I'm looking forward to you joining me on these 3 occasions. And we'll, as we move into the fall, have a lineup of really terrific speakers. And finally, I have the great honor of having been invited by the Carnegie Endowment to have a Pride Month conversation with Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton on June 17th. And I hope that you will join me for that great honor to talk about the progress that has been made and the work that yet remains. So thank you all so much for joining us at Ideas at Ford. Until we see you next time with Annette Gordon-Reed signing off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again,
Thank you so much.
Dambisa.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you soon, Darren. Bye-bye. Thank you.